What if I told you that the trauma of a so-called broken home actually begins um, 11 years before the parents ever even signed the divorce papers?
Right, yeah, 11 years.
11 years. I mean, before the lawyers, before the packing boxes, before any of the custody arrangements. The damage that we constantly blame on the divorce itself was already actively showing up in the child's behavior.
It was wild. It completely upends the entire timeline of how we think about family psychology
Absolutely.
because we spend so much time in looking at the event of the separation, the legal decree itself, but the reality of the child's experience is shaped by this invisible, decade-long buildup.
That one single statistic just completely rewired how I view this entire topic. And honestly, it is just one of many mind-bending revelations we're unpacking today. So welcome to you, the listener, to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, our mission is to basically dismantle everything you think you know about the broken home. We are taking a comprehensive, myth-busting journey into this foundational piece of research by Linda Nielsen, which is all about students from divorced and blended families.
And it is such a critical text because it challenged the conventional wisdom of its time. And honestly, it contains these sociological truths that so many institutions,
Especially schools.
especially schools, yeah, are still genuinely struggling to grasp today.
So we've got three core goals for this deep dive. First, we're going to systematically dispel the long-held, genuinely damaging myths about children of divorce.
Right.
Second, we're going to uncover the surprising hidden factors that actually dictate a student's success or failure. Factors that, as we'll see, have very little to do with the actual piece of paper dissolving a marriage.
Which is the biggest shocker for most people.
Exactly. And third, we are going to explore some highly actionable, practical strategies that schools and communities really must adopt to support these families.
So, to truly understand why this research was such a paradigm shift, we have to set the demographic stage.
Right. Let's look at the context.
The source data presents this massive seismic shift in the American family structure around the early 90s. The author projected that by the year 2000, only about 30% of students would be living with both biological parents throughout their entire teenage years.
Wait, only 30%.
Yeah, only 30%.
Let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this, that means 70% of students were navigating some form of major structural family change before they even graduated high school.
The trajectory was staggering. I mean, the text notes that the number of single mothers skyrocketed from 2.8 million in 1980 to 9.7 million by 1990.
Wow.
In just 10 years, that demographic more than tripled.
That's a massive societal shift.
And furthermore, the data showed a huge surge in births outside of marriage across all demographics. Between 1940 and 1985, there was an increase of 725% among white women and 306% among minority women. So we were looking at an entirely new sociological landscape. An increasing percentage of students had never even lived in a home with married parents to begin with.
Okay, before we go any further, I want to do a quick impartiality check here. Because the source material deals heavily with demographics, including race, class, and socioeconomic status.
Right, it's deeply sociological.
And the data makes it clear that family structure, race, and poverty are all deeply intertwined.
They are. For example, the source notes that, historically, one-parent households were more common among African Americans than white or Asian American families. However, and this is crucial,
Yeah, this is a big distinction.
the data makes this vital point that poverty is a much more statistically significant correlate with single-parent family status than race is.
So the money matters more than the demographic.
Exactly. Additionally, a mother's education level heavily dictates her likelihood of being married and avoiding divorce.
Right, and the goal of our conversation today isn't to judge or politicize these demographic realities.
Absolutely not.
We aren't taking sides on the cultural shifts of the late 20th century. Whether you, the listener, view those shifts through a conservative lens of family breakdown or a more progressive lens of shifting social norms.
We are strictly unpacking the data.
Yes, the sociological and psychological data provided in the research just to understand the mechanics of what happens to these children. And, more importantly, how we can actually help the students living in these realities.
The data is a map, not a moral judgment. And to read the map correctly, we have to look at the terrain as it actually is.
Which brings me back to you, the listener. Whether you are an educator who has been agonizing over how to reach a struggling student, or someone who grew up navigating the complexities of a blended family yourself, or just, a lifelong learner fascinated by human behavior,
Yeah.
this deep dive is going to fundamentally change your perspective.
Because how we think about these families completely dictates how we treat them.
Exactly. Which is exactly where our source material begins its critique.
Right. Before we can even understand what happens to kids during a divorce, we have to examine the incredibly flawed lenses through which
By
adults,
and researchers.
yes, and critically, the early researchers themselves historically viewed these children.
So how did the scientific and educational communities get this so wrong for so long?
Well, the research points out a massive foundational error, which is the disadvantaged presupposition.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
For decades, early research and school personnel approached the very concept of single-parent or blended homes with this intensely biased assumption. They started with the baked-in premise that these homes were inherently broken.
It's like looking through a keyhole into a room.
Right.
If you choose to look through a keyhole that only points at a dark, messy corner, you're going to write a research paper concluding that the entire room is pitch black and messy.
That is a perfect analogy.
You completely ignore the fact that the rest of the room might be brightly lit and perfectly fine.
Human observation is profoundly prone to suggestion. When these researchers went into these non-traditional homes, specifically looking for emotional and academic problems,
We found them.
they inevitably found them, and they completely ignored the kids in these family structures who were thriving, well-adjusted, and academically successful.
And the source highlights some very specific methodological shortcomings in that past research. The sample bias was just off the charts.
It really was.
Researchers were gathering their data predominantly from troubled children who had already been referred to clinics or counselors, rather than taking a truly random sample of the general population.
It is the equivalent of judging the general health of an entire city by exclusively interviewing people sitting in the emergency room.
Right.
Of course, your data will suggest everyone is terribly sick.
Ah.
To compound the error, these early researchers often failed to collect comparative data from children living in intact two-parent homes.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this failure. They would see a teenager from a divorced family struggling with anxiety or slipping grades, and they would immediately just write down cause, divorce.
Without ever checking to see if a similar percentage of teenagers in married households were also experiencing anxiety or slipping grades.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they didn't use a control group.
That is a massive scientific failure.
Yeah.
So what happens when you actually fix the science? What happens when you put away the keyhole, open the door, and look at a proper large-scale randomized sample?
The counter evidence is overwhelming, and it completely contradicts the broken home narrative. The source cites this massive survey of 10,000 high school students.
10,000? That's a real sample size.
It is, and this study found that adolescents who experienced authoritative, democratic, firm but accepting parenting earned higher grades, were more self-reliant, less depressed, and significantly less likely to engage in delinquent behavior.
Okay, we need to unpack what authoritative, democratic, firm but accepting actually means in the real world. Because that can sound like just a string of academic buzzwords. What does that look like in someone's living room?
Think of it as a balance of high expectations and high warmth.
High expectations, high warmth. I like that.
So an authoritative parent sets clear boundaries. For example, you have a curfew of 10 p.m. because you need sleep for school, but they explain the reasoning behind it.
Right.
It's democratic because the child feels heard. The parent might say, I know you want to stay out later for the party, and I hear your frustration, but the rule stands for your well-being.
It's a conversation, not just a dictatorship.
Exactly. It's firm, but accepting of the child's emotions. This is in stark contrast to an authoritarian parent who says, be home at 10 p.m. because I said so, and if you cry about it, you're grounded.
Or a permissive parent who just says, come home whenever.
Right. The kids who get that sweet spot of high warmth and clear boundaries, they thrive. But here's the crucial point. The 10,000 student survey found that this held true regardless of whether their parents were divorced or married.
The parenting style, not the marital status, was the determining factor.
Exactly.
That is huge. And it goes further. There was another massive survey of 7,000 students, ranging from age 6 to 17. And they found literally no significant differences between children of divorced and non-divorced parents regarding IQ scores, physical health, emotional development, or peer relations.
A sample size of 7,000 is robust. Finding no significant differences across those vital metrics completely shatters the default assumption of the disadvantaged child.
But I mean, I have to express some genuine skepticism here. Because looking at that data, it almost makes it sound like divorce is completely frictionless, like kids just bounce right back without a scratch, and the whole thing is just a minor scheduling inconvenience. Is that what the research is arguing?
Not at all, and this is where the research gets incredibly nuanced. The author is not suggesting that divorce is painless. It causes deep, undeniable pain and disruption for a child.
Of course.
But here's the critical distinction. The source of the academic decline, the behavioral issues, and the severe emotional distress. It isn't the legal dissolution of the marriage itself.
The piece of paper from the judge doesn't lower a kid's math grade.
Precisely.
So what does?
The massive, devastating collateral damage that tends to accompany the separation, it's not the divorce, it's the fallout.
If we're talking about fallout, we really have to start with the money. Because the numbers presented in the source here are terrifying. It details that within just 4 months of a separation, the custodial mother's available income drops by an average of 37%.
Over a third of the household resources just gone in the span of a single semester.
And it pushes the poverty rate for these children off an absolute cliff. The percentage of these kids living below the poverty level jumps from 19% to 36% almost overnight.
It's a staggering drop.
We need to really think about what that means for a student on a practical Tuesday morning level. Because a 37% drop in income isn't just about, skipping summer camp or eating generic cereal.
No, it translates to radical structural destabilization of the child's entire world. First and foremost, it usually dictates a housing change.
Right, because they can't afford the rent anymore?
The family can no longer afford the mortgage or the rent, so they have to move to a smaller, cheaper apartment.
Which almost inevitably means moving out of their current school district.
And that triggers an entire cascade of losses. The child is forced into a new school mid-year. They lose their teachers who understood their learning style.
They lose their routines.
They lose their familiar daily routines. And most devastatingly, for a developing child or adolescent, they lose their entire peer support network right at the exact moment their home life is collapsing.
And even inside the new home, the environment is fundamentally altered. You have cramped quarters. Maybe siblings who used to have their own space to decompress are now sharing a single room, which immediately spikes interpersonal friction and stress.
There's no quiet place to do homework.
Right. For teenagers, there is an even more tangible academic cost. The source notes that the financial pinch often means teenagers have to take on part-time jobs just to help the mother keep the lights on or buy groceries.
Let's follow the mechanics of that into the classroom. A teenager is trading study hours and sleep for minimum wage shifts. So when a teacher looks at a 10th grader from a recently divorced family who is falling asleep at their desk or failing a biology test, the teacher's inherent bias might lead them to think, oh, this poor kid is so emotionally depressed about the broken home.
When the reality is deeply practical. He's exhausted.
Exactly. He's failing biology because he was working until midnight at a grocery store to compensate for a household income that just plummeted by nearly 40%.
That distinction changes entirely how a school should intervene.
Yeah.
You don't need to send that kid to a grief counselor. You need to give him an extension on his homework or a quiet study hall period.
The poverty mimics the symptoms of emotional trauma.
But the money is only one part of the fallout. We also have to look at the emotional war zone.
The conflict, both before and after the divorce. The research highlights one of the best documented findings in this entire field. Children suffer the fewest negative consequences when their parents can simply be cordial to each other post-separation.
But unfortunately, cordiality is pretty rare in these situations.
It is. The source mentions that kids as young as 18 months old show measurable distress when their parents argue.
18 months. They don't even have the cognitive vocabulary to understand a single word of what is being shouted across the kitchen, but they absorb the hostility in the air like a sponge.
The chronic stress of a hostile environment fundamentally alters a child's sense of safety. The data shows that by the time they are 5 or 6 years old, they will actively try to intervene in the quarrels. Yeah, they try to physically step between the parents or distract them.
Which puts an incredible, unnatural psychological burden on a kindergartner. They become the emotional regulator for the adults.
It's tragic.
And we have to talk about the prolonged agony of what researchers call ambivalence. Because a lot of couples don't just legally divorce overnight. They take months, sometimes years, to emotionally decouple.
The phenomenon of trial separations. The parents might physically separate, then try to reconcile for a few months, then separate again. To a child, this is psychological torture.
They are trapped in an ever-changing web of makeshift rules. One week dad is living in the guest room, the next week he's in an apartment across town. But the most cruel aspect is the false hope of reunification.
Yes, the constant wondering.
The child spends years wondering, are my parents really divorced? If I behave better, will dad come back? If mom cooks his favorite meal, will the trial separation end?
That chronic ambivalence prevents the child from grieving. You cannot heal from a wound if the knife is continually being pulled out and reinserted.
Which brings us back to that staggering statistic we opened the show with. It completely shatters the timeline we usually associate with a failing marriage.
The 11-year pre-existing condition.
Right. The source cites a massive 5-year longitudinal study looking at 15,000 British families and 2,000 U.S. families. They tracked these kids over time.
And what did they find?
They found that the behavioral problems we constantly blame on the divorce, the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the tantrums, the bad dreams, the aggression in school, these issues existed in boys up to 11 years before the parents actually got legally divorced.
By the time the judge bangs the gavel and issues the divorce decree, that child had been exhibiting severe trauma symptoms for over a decade.
We've been blaming the explosion for the structural damage when the termites have been eating the foundation for 10 years.
Exactly.
The hostility, the screaming matches, the silent treatments, the palpable tension at the dinner table, that was the actual trauma.
And here is the mechanism that proves it. When researchers mathematically controlled for the behavioral problems that existed before the separation, the apparent negative impact of the divorce itself on boys' behavior and grades virtually disappeared.
Let me repeat that because it's so important for you listening to really hear this. If you account for the trauma the kid was already showing while the parents were married, the divorce itself caused almost zero additional drop in their grades or behavior.
It's a huge revelation.
So all those couples who say, we are staying together for the kids,
Yeah.
in a high-conflict, hostile home, is staying together actually doing the exact damage they think the divorce would do.
That is precisely what the longitudinal data suggests. The child is absorbing the toxicity of the failing marriage every single day.
So we've established the deep impact of sudden poverty and chronic long-term conflict. But what happens to the physical makeup of the home once the separation actually happens?
Right, the post-divorce reality.
Because the mother loses 37% of her income, she's working double shifts, the kids are stressed, you would naturally assume the other parent steps in to fill that supervision gap, does he?
The statistics on the vanishing father are truly stark, and they paint a very different picture. According to the census data cited in the text, 90% of children live with their mothers post-divorce.
90%. That is an overwhelming majority.
It is. And this was true even in cases where joint custody was officially awarded by the court. The physical reality was that the kids stayed with mom.
But where it gets genuinely alarming is the lack of contact.
Yes. In a large-scale study of 2,200 children between the ages of 7 and 11, over 50% had not seen their father at all in the past year.
Wait, stop. Half.
Half.
Half of the kids in that massive study had not seen their dad for a single weekend visit, or a birthday dinner, or a quick afternoon at the park in 365 days.
Not once. And the data gets even darker. In another survey of 1,300 children ranging from 1 to 17 years old, more than 75% had either never seen their father following the divorce or saw him less than once a month.
Why? What is driving this mass vanishing act? I mean, my immediate assumption would be that the father remarries, has new kids, and kind of forgets about his first family.
That's a common assumption, but the source says that isn't the primary driver. Remarriage plays a role, yes, mostly because it increases the chances of the father moving to another town to start his new life, creating geographic distance.
Right.
But the primary drivers of absence, according to the research, are distance, income, and conflict. Specifically, many fathers state that they simply stop seeing their children because they want to avoid any contact whatsoever with their ex-wives.
They're willing to entirely abandon their relationship with their own child just to escape the hostility of the ex-spouse. That speaks volumes about the level of toxicity in these fractured marriages, that a parent would rather become a ghost than endure another drop-off argument in a driveway.
It's tragic for the child.
But what happens to the kids who do get to see their dads?
Well, on the surface, the data shows immense benefits. Frequent contact with the father is strongly correlated with better grades, more self-confidence, less depression, and less aggressive behavior in the classroom.
But I'm sensing a massive caveat coming.
A very crucial caveat. As analysts, we have to look at the confounding variables. The source points out that the fathers who do manage to visit frequently are typically wealthier, more highly educated, and are the ones actively paying child support.
Ah, the socioeconomics variable.
Yes. So we have to ask a critical question. Are the children benefiting purely from the emotional presence of the father, or are they benefiting from the socioeconomic stability that this specific demographic of fathers brings to the table?
Are they doing better in school because dad took them to the park on Sunday and threw a baseball, or because dad is affluent enough to ensure they live in a safe neighborhood, have access to high-speed internet, and can afford a math tutor?
Exactly. It's likely both, but you can't untangle the money from the emotional support.
And the source explicitly states that if frequent visits from the father just expose the child to more parental fighting during those drop-offs and pickups, the positive psychological benefits of the father's presence are completely canceled out.
The conflict overrides the visit.
Furthermore, think about how geographic distance and disposable income dictate a father's presence more than anything else. If you're listening to this, think about the mechanics of what we just uncovered. It means our entire system accidentally double punishes lower-income students.
Walk us through that cycle.
Okay, so a lower-income family divorces, the mother immediately plummets into poverty, taking that 37% income hit. The father, also lacking resources, maybe has to move further away to find cheaper housing, or he literally cannot afford the gas money or the reliable transportation to maintain regular visits.
The logistics become impossible.
Right. The student loses the financial stability, and because of that specific lack of money, they physically lose the dad too. The poverty creates the absence. It's a vicious cycle that affluent families can just buy their way out of.
That is an incredibly astute reading of the sociological mechanics at play. Poverty acts as a physical wedge that separates the non-custodial parent from the child.
So we have looked at the macro factors, the sudden poverty, the 11 years of pre-existing conflict, the vanishing fathers. But how does this play out in a classroom of 30 kids?
On the ground level.
Yeah. If you were a fifth-grade teacher, why do some children of divorce throw chairs across the room while others just quietly fade away into the background?
It turns out gender plays a massive defining role in how children process the immediate aftermath of a family rupture. The coping mechanisms are entirely different.
Let's start with the boys, the plight of the sons. Because the source says they initially show far more aggression, defiance, and academic decline than girls do.
They do. And there are three fascinating psychological and structural reasons for this. First is what we can call the opposite-sex parent factor.
Right.
Research consistently shows that, generally speaking, children adjust better, showing more social maturity and self-confidence when they live with their same-sex parent.
But as we just established, 90% of these kids are living with their mothers post-divorce.
Exactly. So right out of the gate, boys are at a structural disadvantage. They are navigating this trauma without a same-sex role model in the house. And the data indicates that in both single-parent and two-parent households, mothers generally struggle more to control their son's behavior than fathers do.
Okay, the structural disadvantage makes sense. But the second reason, this is a deep psychological mechanism that blew my mind, the maternal projection.
This is a deeply subconscious, deeply human psychological defense mechanism.
Let's explain the mechanics of transference here.
The text explains that mothers who harbor intense, unresolved anger toward their ex-husbands will often subconsciously project those negative traits onto their sons.
The mother is exhausted, she's hurting, she's angry. She looks at her 12-year-old son, and maybe he has his father's eyes. Maybe he has the exact same laugh or a similar stubborn streak.
And subconsciously, she stops reacting to him as a grieving child and starts reacting to him as the ghost of the man who ruined her life.
The son becomes a proxy for the ex-husband.
The mother becomes increasingly critical, unsupportive, and coercive toward the boy. She disciplines him more harshly because she is filtering his normal, childish misbehavior through the lens of her ex-husband's betrayals.
And what does a young boy do when he feels cornered, constantly criticized, and unfairly targeted by his primary caregiver?
He acts out.
He acts out. He doesn't have the emotional vocabulary to say, "Mother, I feel you're projecting your marital trauma onto me." He just feels angry and trapped. The text specifically links this feeling of maternal coercion to aggressive acting out behavior at school. The boy is fighting his mother's proxy war in the classroom. He throws the chair because he can't yell at his mom.
And that leads directly to the third factor, driving boys' aggression, the front row seat to violence.
This one is so sad.
Studies show that parents actually tend to fight more intensely and more physically in front of their sons than they do in front of their daughters.
Why would parents do that? Do they think the boys can somehow handle it better?
Likely, yes. There is a deeply ingrained cultural assumption that boys are tougher, less fragile, and less susceptible to emotional damage. So parents lower their filters.
They don't hold back as much.
The tragic result is that boys are exposed to significantly more verbal and physical violence during the dissolution of the marriage, and behavior is modeled. The boys learn from watching their parents that anger is expressed through volume and aggression, and they take that exact lesson straight to the playground.
Which makes total sense when you trace the causality. But while the boys are being loud and aggressive, we absolutely cannot ignore the invisible struggle of the daughters.
This is a critical warning for every educator listening. Girls suffer just as much, but they express their grief differently.
Culturally and psychologically, girls are often conditioned to internalize trauma. They express their deep sadness through withdrawal, extreme compliance, and depression.
And think about how that plays out for a teacher managing 30 kids. If a boy is throwing a textbook across the room, he gets immediate intervention.
He gets sent to the counselor, the parents are called, action is taken.
Right. But a depressed, withdrawn girl who sits quietly in the back row and stares at her desk, she isn't disrupting the lesson plan, so she flies completely under the radar.
The teachers don't notice her trauma. The early researchers didn't notice her trauma. For decades, the adult world equated a girl being quiet with her being well-adjusted.
It is an incredibly dangerous assumption that leaves daughters to suffer in silence.
However, there is a silver lining here in the longitudinal data, a phenomenon we can call the long-term equalizer.
Relying on a representative sample of nearly 1,200 children, researchers found that if you follow these kids over a long enough timeline, the dramatic gender differences in academic struggles and psychological distress virtually disappear.
The boys eventually calm down and develop better coping mechanisms, and the girls stabilize and find their footing.
But they don't stabilize in a vacuum. Time alone isn't the only healer. Which leads us to look at what happens when the environment fundamentally shifts again.
Right. If the immediate aftermath of a divorce is defined by poverty, loss of daily routine, and emotional chaos, what happens to the ecosystem when a new adult enters the picture?
Enter the stepfamily.
To understand the massive impact of the step-parent, we first have to deeply understand the specific dynamic of the single-mother household that precedes it.
Yes, the researcher identifies a phenomenon that is incredibly common called the peer-to-parent trap.
If you're listening to this and you grew up with a single mom, you might be nodding your head right now. You probably remember the exact moment you felt like you crossed the line from being a child to becoming her confidant.
I found the breakdown of this incredibly empathetic.
It really is. A single mother is suddenly alone, stripped of a third of her income, and completely overwhelmed by the logistics of survival. Out of sheer necessity and emotional exhaustion, she often develops a more peer-like relationship with her children.
She relies on them for emotional support. She might confide in her teenage daughter about adult financial problems or her dating struggles.
Or she might treat her oldest son as a co-parent, expecting him to discipline the younger siblings.
And while that might sound touching on a human level, like the family is banding together to survive structurally, it's disastrous for the child's development.
It obliterates the necessary family hierarchy.
Exactly. A child needs the parent to be an authoritative wall they can push against to find their boundaries. When the wall becomes a peer, the child feels incredibly insecure.
Furthermore, because the mother is working so much, there is simply less time to supervise, resulting in the classic latchkey kids scenario.
And without that clear authoritative boundary and supervision, what does the data show? The data shows these kids have significantly higher rates of playing hooky, experimenting with drugs, engaging in early sexual activity, and consequently much higher rates of teen pregnancy.
The structure has completely collapsed, and the kids are essentially raising themselves.
But then, the demographic data shows that 80% of these mothers remarry within 4 years.
80%.
And remarriage is a statistical game changer for the child's trajectory.
It's a total reset of the board.
It is. First, it instantly restores the family income to pre-divorce levels, eliminating that crushing daily poverty stress we discussed earlier.
The teenager doesn't have to work until midnight anymore.
Second, it profoundly improves the mother's emotional well-being. She has a partner again to share the adult burdens. But most importantly, for the student's academic and behavioral life, it reestablishes the hierarchical structure.
Think about it like this. The family is a ship that lost its captain in a storm. For 4 years, the crew, the kids, have been running the deck.
They've been patching leaks, navigating the waves, managing the rations.
They are exhausted from doing an adult's job. Suddenly, a stepfather comes aboard. He takes the wheel, there's a chain of command again. The kids can finally stop bailing water and just go back to being passengers.
They are allowed to just be kids again.
The ship analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of relief. And returning to the gender divide, the source notes that this arrival of the stepfather is particularly measurably beneficial for the boys.
Why do the sons react so well to the new captain? Because it provides two things the boy has been desperately lacking. Structured, authoritative discipline to rein in the aggression he's been acting out, and a consistent same-sex role model in the house.
The data shows that boys' behavioral issues drop significantly when a stepfather enters the picture and enforces consistent boundaries.
But how do the girls react to the new captain? Interestingly, teenage girls in particular often intensely resist the new authority figure at first.
Because they had that tight, peer-like bond with their mother. They were the first mate. And suddenly this new man is interrupting that bond, demoting them back to being a child and trying to enforce a curfew.
Exactly. It causes intense initial friction. The daughter feels replaced or sidelined. But long-term, the structural stability, the return of the mother's attention, and the financial security ultimately benefit the girls academically and emotionally just as much as the boys.
We have covered so much ground today. We've spent a lot of time diagnosing the patient, the biased history, the hidden mechanism of poverty, the long-term conflict, the vanishing fathers, the gender dynamics, and the step-family reset.
Now let's talk about the cure.
The action plan. Because schools are not responsible for the divorce, but they are the primary environment where this child has to function for 8 hours a day. How must schools adapt to this reality?
The very first step the research demands is re-educating the educators. We have to confront the institutional biases we talked about at the beginning.
The data showed that teachers often rated children of divorce more negatively than the children rated themselves.
The teachers were actively projecting the broken home stereotype onto the kids. They assumed the kid was broken, so they treated them like they were broken.
Which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Teachers need to be trained to understand that initial post-divorce behaviors are temporary grief responses, whether it's a boy throwing a tantrum or, interestingly, an elementary student suddenly becoming obsessively tidy, hyper-perfectionistic, and overly dependent on the teacher's approval.
Wait, explain that perfectionist response, because that seems like a good thing for a teacher.
To a teacher, it looks like a model student, but psychologically, the child's home life just shattered, so they are trying to fiercely control their classroom environment.
Wow. They are terrified that if they aren't perfect, the teacher might abandon them just like their dad did.
Exactly. Educators need to recognize these behaviors as coping mechanisms for trauma, not permanent character flaws.
Once the teachers are recalibrated, we can look at the curriculum and classroom tweaks. First up on the list, bibliotherapy.
It is a fantastic, highly effective tool. Bibliotherapy is the practice of using specific books and literature to help kids process their lived experiences.
Schools can stock their libraries and classrooms with books that feature blended families, single-parent homes, and divorced parents as normal, viable, everyday alternatives to the nuclear family.
It reduces the child's feeling of intense isolation. It shows them, you are not an anomaly. Your family structure is written about in books just like everyone else's.
We also need to banish the vocabulary of failure from the school building. Stop using pejoratives like broken home entirely. A family that has escaped an abusive, high-conflict situation is not broken, it is rescued. Words matter.
The author also stresses what we might call economic empathy in lesson planning. Teachers must stop assigning out-of-class projects that require expensive materials or extensive parental supervision.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this because it happens all the time. A teacher assigns a fourth-grade science project to build a scale model of a volcano. It requires $40 in arts and crafts supplies from a hobby store and 3 hours of a parent's time to help use the hot glue gun and paint it.
Right.
A single mother working a double shift to make up for a 37% income drop simply cannot provide that money or that time. The child comes to school with a subpar project made out of trash and feels immense shame.
The school has inadvertently punished the child for their parents' divorce. It sets the student up for failure. All assignments need to be achievable with the resources available inside the classroom.
Now, let's move to how schools can de-escalate the emotional war between parents via administrative policy. This is where the source gets incredibly practical. Genius-level tweaks that cost $0. Number 1. duplicate information.
It is so simple, yet so profound. Schools should automatically mail report cards, newsletters, and parent-teacher meeting announcements to both parents separately by default.
Think about the friction that removes. The ex-spouses never have to text or call each other to share the information. And more importantly, you stop using the child as a messenger pigeon between two hostile adults.
The child doesn't have to sit in the car and say, "Mom told me to give you this report card."
You remove the school as a catalyst for domestic arguments.
Along those same lines, schools need to offer separate parent-teacher conferences. If the parents cannot be in the same small room without tension, do not force them. Offer separate seating at graduations and school plays.
The school should act as a neutral Switzerland, a safe haven for the child, not a gladiator arena for unresolved marital disputes.
And we need direct outreach to the non-custodial parents. Mail invitations to the school play or the science fare directly to the fathers. Bypass the ex-wife entirely, so the father knows he is specifically wanted and welcomed by the school administration.
And extend that exact same courtesy to step-parents.
Step-parents are often treated as second-class citizens by school bureaucracies. Give them their own tickets. Address them by name. Acknowledge their vital role in stabilizing the child's life.
Finally, the source delves into counseling innovations. Schools need specialized, targeted support that goes beyond generic grief counseling. For example, hosting boys-only groups.
Because, as we discussed, boys are culturally conditioned to only express emotion through anger and aggression. They need a safe space, away from girls, to learn how to express sadness, fear, or confusion without feeling weak or unmasculine.
Counselors also need to actively work to prevent the parentified child syndrome we saw in the single-mother households. They need to gently teach boys that they do not have to be the man of the house at age 12.
And teach girls that it isn't their job to take care of daddy or be mom's therapist now that the marriage is over.
Counselors also have to help teenagers navigate the incredibly awkward, uncharted reality of their parents' newfound sexuality and dating lives.
Imagine being 15 years old. You are dealing with your own hormonal chaos, trying to figure out dating yourself, and suddenly your 45-year-old newly divorced parent is dressing differently, going out to bars, and bringing new romantic partners into the house.
It's wildly destabilizing. It flips the entire parent-child dynamic on its head.
It is. But group counseling works incredibly well for all of these issues. The source highlights a highly successful 4-month group program designed for second and third graders. They used games, role-playing, and structured activities to clarify one essential, liberating truth for the kids. Divorce is a grown-up problem.
It is not the child's fault.
The program dramatically improved what they called family esteem, helping kids see that their non-traditional family was still perfectly valid and whole.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. Let's synthesize the massive amount of sociological ground we just covered. We've learned today that the very phrase broken home is a cultural myth built on fundamentally flawed, biased science.
We uncovered that the real enemies of student success are not the divorce decree, but sudden, severe poverty, unresolved, chronic parental conflict, and the loss of daily hierarchy and structure.
We explored how boys and girls grieve the loss of their family unit differently. Boys with volume and aggression, girls with silence and withdrawal. We uncovered the surprising, deeply stabilizing power of a step-parent taking the wheel.
And we laid out deeply practical ways schools can change something as simple as their mailing lists, seating charts, and homework assignments to literally save a kid's sanity.
But if I may, I'd like to leave the listener with one final thread to pull, something that challenges our deepest, most ingrained societal assumptions.
Please.
If the data clearly shows that children are ultimately more emotionally mature, more resilient, and academically stable after their parents leave a high-conflict marriage, and if we know for a mathematical fact that the behavioral issues in these kids started to 11 years before the legal divorce,
It begs the question.
does that mean our entire cultural definition of a failed marriage is backwards? Is it possible that the divorce isn't the failure of the family, but the first necessary step in its rescue?
That is a profound question to chew on. Is the divorce the trauma? Or is it the cast that is finally allowing the 11-year-old broken bone to heal?
We encourage you to look at the students and the families in your own community through this new data-driven lens. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.